The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines shattered the cold morning silence as a formation of B-17 flying fortresses lifted into the gray English sky. The ground trembled beneath the thunder of their takeoff, each aircraft carrying 10 young men who knew that today's mission might be their last. From the windows of farmhouses and village streets below, locals paused to watch the great bombers climb, their wings heavy with bombs destined for the heart of Nazi Germany. Inside the fuselage, the air was thick with the smell of fuel and oil. Leather gloves gripped control yokes, nervous hands checked machine guns, and each crew member exchanged silent glances that spoke louder than words. At 25,000 feet, there would be no place to hide, only courage and faith to carry them through the black clouds of flak and the onslaught of German fighters. This was no ordinary airplane. The Flying Fortress was a symbol of determination, a fortress of steel and fire sent to break the enemy's grip on Europe. And for every man on board, the sound of those engines was more than noise. It was a reminder of duty, sacrifice, and the hope that freedom would prevail. By 1943, the war over Europe had reached a deadly stalemate. Britain's Royal Air Force had been striking German cities at night, but those raids, while destructive, often scattered across civilian areas with little precision. The United States Army Air Forces brought with them a new doctrine: daylight bombing with the Flying Fortress. The idea was simple, but bold. Strike deep into the heart of Germany's industrial machine in broad daylight with enough accuracy to cripple factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. It was a strategy rooted in faith, not only in American technology, but in the bravery of the men who would fly straight into the teeth of the enemy's defenses. Precision meant visibility, and visibility meant danger. Crews were ordered to hold steady formations even as black bursts of flak filled the sky around them, even as swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore through the bomber stream. This approach carried a terrible cost, but it also carried a promise that every bomb dropped would bring the war one step closer to its end. For the young airmen climbing into their B-17s each morning, the mission was larger than survival. It was about delivering a blow so decisive that it might shorten the war and bring their brothers on the ground and the families waiting back home closer to peace. What made the Flying Fortress so extraordinary was not just its size, but its design. A machine built to endure punishment and still bring its crew home. The B-17 carried the strength of American industry in every rivet and every steel plate. With 4 powerful engines, a massive wingspan, and the ability to haul thousands of pounds of bombs across the continent, it stood as a marvel of engineering in its time. But it was the guns that gave the fortress its name. 13.50 caliber Browning. Machine guns bristled from its nose, sides, belly, and tail. No matter which direction the enemy came from, there was always a barrel waiting. German fighter pilots quickly learned that attacking a tight formation of B-17s was like charging headlong into a wall of lead. Many never made it out alive. Even so, the real measure of the B-17 was its toughness. Crews told stories of fortresses limping back to England with engines gone, tails shredded, or wings torn open by flak, yet somehow still able to land. These weren't just machines of war. They were lifelines, carrying men through fire and steel when survival seemed impossible. For those who flew them, the fortress was more than an aircraft. It was a promise that even in the darkest skies they would not face death alone. Yet even the strongest fortress was only as powerful as the men inside it. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10, and every role mattered. At the controls sat the pilot and co-pilot, responsible for guiding the heavy bomber through skies filled with danger. Beside them, the navigator plotted the course across hostile territory, while the bombardier crouched in the nose, ready to release the payload with precision that could change the course of a battle. Behind the cockpit, the flight engineer kept the engines alive, monitoring every dial and gauge as the hours stretched on. Around him were the gunners, spread throughout the aircraft like sentinels in a flying fortress, 1 in the tail, 2 on the sides, 1 in the top turret, another in the ball turret hanging precariously beneath the belly. These men spent entire missions scanning the skies, eyes straining, fingers ready on the triggers. They knew the enemy could come at any second, from any direction. What bound them together was not the steel of the airframe, but the trust between brothers. 10 young men, often barely out of high school, depending on each other for survival in a world where a single mistake could send them all tumbling from the sky. In those freezing, oxygen-starved altitudes, friendships became unbreakable bonds. Each mission was not just a test of skill, but of loyalty, courage, and faith. The heart of every flying fortress was not its guns or engines, it was the crew who kept her alive. A typical mission began long before sunrise, when the crews were roused from their bunks on English airfields and marched through the damp morning fog toward briefing rooms. Maps were unrolled, targets circled, and the words no crew wanted to hear, Berlin, brought a hush over the room. Flying into the German capital meant the longest flight, the heaviest defenses, and the highest chance that some of the men present would not return. Once airborne, the formation of B-17s stretched across the sky like a steel armada. Crossing the English Channel was the last moment of calm. Beyond lay the flak belts of occupied Europe. At 20,000 feet, the first bursts appeared, black clouds of shrapnel exploding with violent force. The fortress shuddered as fragments rattled against her skin, the men inside bracing for the next impact. Yet the order remained the same. Hold formation, keep steady, press forward. Then came the fighters. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose to meet them, diving headlong into the bomber stream. The air erupted in tracers, the gunners of the fortress firing their .50 calibers in desperate unison. Every man became both target and defender. Some fortresses exploded in mid-air, torn apart by cannon fire, while others limped on, scarred but unbroken. Reaching the target was only half the battle. The bombardier crouched in the nose, hands steady as the bomb bay doors yawned open. Amid the chaos, he lined up the target, factories, rail yards, oil plants, and released the bombs that tumbled toward their mark. A sudden lift told the crew their burden was gone, but the journey home still stretched for hours. Each mile back to England was a fight against exhaustion, fear, and fate. Many crews returned to base with engines dead, wings shredded, or holes big enough to crawl through. Some never returned at all, but those who made it knew they had struck at the very heart of the enemy. A mission to Berlin was more than steel and fire. It was proof of endurance, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to see the war through. The triumph of reaching Berlin and striking the target always came with a shadow, for the price of those missions was measured not in fuel or steel, but in lives. Entire formations sometimes returned with gaping holes in their ranks, empty spaces where fortresses had once flown wingtip to wingtip. Each absence meant 10 young men who had vanished into the smoke, their fate unknown, shot down over fields swallowed by fire or captured behind enemy lines. Losses could be staggering. On the infamous raid over Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, nearly 60 B-17s failed to return in a single day. That meant more than 600 airmen gone in one mission. The numbers were cold and merciless, but behind every statistic was a name, a face, a family waiting back home for a letter that would never arrive. For the men who survived, watching a friend's fortress spiral down in flames left scars deeper than shrapnel ever could. Inside the aircraft, the toll was constant. Shrapnel tore through cabins, engines burst into flames, oxygen systems froze at high altitude. Medics pulled half-frozen gunners out of turrets, their hands locked to the triggers even in death. Some crews limped back to England on 3 engines, sometimes 2, their aircraft riddled with holes large enough to let daylight stream through. They landed battered but alive, haunted by the knowledge that others had not been so lucky. And yet, they climbed back in the very next day. It was not for glory or for medals, but because they knew the war would not be won without their sacrifice. Every fortress that fell took pieces of the men's hearts with it, but every bomb that hit its mark brought the war closer to ending. The true cost of the flying fortress was carried in silence by those who endured, and in eternal remembrance of those who never came home. For all the heartbreak in the skies, the Allies carried with them a weapon the enemy could never match, the sheer force of American industry. While Germany struggled to replace every bomber it lost, the United States was producing hundreds more every month, Boeing, Douglas, and Vega assembly lines ran day and night, turning out B-17s with a speed that stunned the world. From the factories of Seattle to the plants of California, the Flying Fortress rolled off the lines and straight into the war, each one crewed by men who knew they were part of something far larger than themselves. This overwhelming production was not only about numbers, but about resilience. Every fortress shot down over Europe was quickly replaced, and every gap in a squadron's formation was filled within weeks. That relentless rhythm wore down the Luftwaffe, forcing German pilots to fight against wave after wave of bombers that simply never stopped coming. For the enemy, it was like trying to fight back the tide. The results became undeniable. By 1944, the constant hammering of B-17s crippled Germany's oil supplies, shattered its railways, and left factories smoldering. Combined with the courage of the crews, American industry had created an unstoppable momentum. The Flying Fortress was not just a plane, it was proof that a free nation, united in purpose, could summon resources on a scale that no dictatorship could withstand. It was steel, sweat, and sacrifice, fused into a force that paved the way to victory. Behind the statistics and the machinery were the men whose courage gave the Flying Fortress its soul. They were barely more than boys, many just out of high school, yet they carried themselves with a maturity forged in fire. Every mission etched new stories of sacrifice and resilience. Crews told of pilots who refused to abandon their aircraft, holding it steady so their men could parachute to safety, even as flames consumed the wings. Others spoke of gunners who fought until their very last breath, their frozen hands still locked on the triggers when comrades found them. There were miracles, too. Fortresses returning home with tails shot away, wings shredded, or engines gone, yet somehow making it back to English fields. Photographs from those days show young faces smiling beside aircraft riddled with holes, men who had stared death in the eye and lived to see another sunrise. Their courage wasn't found in a single act of heroism, but in the willingness to climb aboard again and again, knowing the odds were against them. What sustained them was brotherhood. 10 men bound together by trust, laughter in the quiet moments, and prayers whispered into oxygen masks. For many, that bond lasted a lifetime, stronger than steel. These personal stories remind us that history is not just about planes or battles. It is about human hearts, beating in unison, daring to believe that their sacrifice could help end the war and bring peace to a world in ruins. When the smoke of war finally lifted, the Flying Fortress had left an indelible mark on history. The relentless bombing campaigns paved the way for the Allied invasion of Europe, breaking the backbone of German industry and cutting off the lifelines that fueled the enemy's war machine. From the skies over Berlin to the factories of the Ruhr, the echo of B-17 engines became a sound the world could not ignore. They were not invincible, but they were unstoppable, and their presence changed the course of the war. Today, only a handful of these great bombers remain. Some stand proudly in museums, silent reminders of the men who once filled their cabins with laughter, fear, and courage. Others still take to the air at commemorative shows, their engines rumbling with the same thunder that once carried them into battle. When people gather to watch them fly, they do not simply see a machine, they see a symbol of resilience, a tribute to those who never returned, and a reminder of the price of freedom. The legacy of the Flying Fortress is not just about steel, bombs, or firepower. It is about the human spirit that refused to break, the unity of a nation that built thousands of aircraft, and the courage of airmen who flew into danger because the world needed them to. Their sacrifices shortened the war and saved countless lives on the ground. As we look back, the B-17 reminds us that freedom is never free. It is earned through sweat, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that good must prevail over tyranny. The roar of the Flying Fortress was more than a sound of war. It was the voice of hope, carrying across the skies of Europe, declaring that liberty would endure.